And Aaron, welcome.
Thanks, Tanya. It's good to be back with you, this time virtually. It's great to be back in the Conservative heartland in Alberta. And I know you've got a lot of snow, so I'm sorry to show that we don't have it here yet in Ottawa. Just another reason to be frustrated with Ottawa, I guess. But listen, I'm just back really from an amazing few days in Alberta last week. I met with entrepreneurs, leaders in the energy sector, Indigenous leaders in Calgary and Didsbury. And then I spent an amazing afternoon in Longview County with leaders from the cattle and the feedlot sectors. These amazing ag leaders even black-hatted this MP from the Toronto suburbs, and they let me survey the most modern feedlot in North America from horseback. Now, given what is on the ground in these feedlots, I'm very glad this city slicker didn't fall off his horse. Now, some of you might have seen me make a surprise appearance on the Premier's Zoom question period last week at your virtual convention. Premier Kenney and I had a great talk on issues Albertans wanted to hear about. And of course, the media, they didn't focus on those issues, but on trying to measure the distance between our chairs on their cell phones. As you know, I launched my campaign to lead the Conservative Party of Canada from Calgary and not in my Ontario riding of Durham. I launched on the Danielle Smith call-in show because I wanted to speak directly to the working men and women of Alberta. I wanted to tell them that there's a small town kid from Bowmanville, Ontario, who's got their back at a challenging time in our country's history. I'm a former Air Force navigator with 12 years of service and a decade of work in the private sector. But before I joined the military, one of my first jobs was as a pipeline inspector on the Trans-Canada Pipeline. In 2012, I won my by-election in the suburbs of Toronto in Durham. I went on to work with the ag sector, especially in Alberta, as Parliamentary Secretary for Trade. And then later, I was Stephen Harper's last cabinet appointment. I worked my way up the ranks in politics, just like I did in the military and in business, not because of what my last name was or who I was connected to, but because I got things done. We won the leadership race because factory workers in my province, energy workers in Western Canada, ag sector workers, farmers, ranchers, small business leaders all stepped up for my campaign. They did this because they believe in this country. And they all believe, regardless of where they are, that Alberta needs to help be back in the driver's seat as our country drives back to economic prosperity after the pandemic and after 5 years of lost leadership under Justin Trudeau. Because, friends, remember, as much as politics might sometimes frustrate you or cause you to lose faith, our democracy matters. Who leads this country? Their experience, their ethics, their values. These things matter. And I'll show you why. 5 years ago, we had a prime minister from Calgary. The Bloc Québécois, the separatist party from Quebec, was down to a couple of seats and didn't matter. 5 years ago, if you said the word Wexit, people would have looked at you funny. Today, the Bloc Québécois is back in force as the third party in the House of Commons. They have more seats than the NDP. And there are more people signed up for a Wexit newsletter than there are members of the Liberal Party of Canada. But Justin Trudeau, in his safe Ottawa bubble, keeps saying that everything is fine. This is what 5 years of out-of-touch leadership can do to a country. Divide East versus West, sector versus sector, blue-collar families versus white-collar families, the connected elites versus the average hardworking Canadian. We have a prime minister right now who prefers photo ops of himself over prosperity for Canadian families. 5 years of ideological Liberal leadership has caused over $160 billion of investment to leave Canada, and for the world's most famous investor, Warren Buffett, to compare our country to basket case countries like Venezuela. Trudeau encouraged activists to stall all pipeline developments. He does nothing in the face of illegal rail blockades. And now when he says he wants to build Canada back better after COVID, that's his code language for leaving out millions of hardworking Canadians in the energy sector, the forestry sector, the auto factories of Ontario, and in steel and aluminum industries across the country. only in Trudeau's Canada would they rather put people on the CERB than put forward a plan to get people back to work. But it's not just our resources that are suffering. The pandemic has brought hardship to the doorsteps of every Canadian family. For millions, it's been the loss of jobs or uncertainty. For 9,000 families, it's been the direct loss of a loved one. Just think about how much better off we could have been if the government had not shut down our pandemic advance warning system. Canada had a world-class pandemic detection unit, and the Liberals shut it down a year before the crisis because they didn't want to upset dictators, because they preferred to trust open source data from China rather than trusting Canadian intelligence experts. The Liberal government killed the Canadian pandemic warning system, and then they were late and confused at every single step of this pandemic. Now, everyone was surprised by COVID. Everyone tried to work hard. I get that. I'm not being unreasonable. But leadership is striving to be the best. Leadership is about learning from your mistakes. Leadership is about putting Canadians first, not putting Liberal insiders and cronies first. Canada is light years behind our allies on all health and economic measures after COVID phase 1 because Justin Trudeau is not a leader. Trudeau was 2 months late on the border. The government was late on getting PPE supplies ready across the country. They even gave away some PPE to China. The Liberals were late on rapid tests, failed on contact tracing, and totally bungled the wage subsidy program. Several million more Canadians were let go and put on CERB by their employers because the Liberals got the wage subsidy wrong. And now they have no plan for these hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Last week, an election amid a pandemic rather than defend his record on COVID. Now, luckily, Albertans have a premier who doesn't wait for a green light from Ottawa, a person who takes charge and makes things happen. Perhaps it's because your premier got to see Mr. Trudeau up close for a few years, and he knew very well that Albertans couldn't afford to wait for leadership from the Trudeau government. Premier Kenney has navigated this COVID-19 pandemic far better than the federal government has. In fact, your province was the first to push Ottawa to approve testing options for Canada to help with economic school reopenings and an overall response. Alberta was the first to roll out widespread testing at pharmacies and was the first to roll out advanced contact tracing measures and applications. You guys even made sure that one of the most important elements of our country kept moving in a time of crisis. You graciously hosted the Stanley Cup hockey playoffs without a single case of COVID disrupting the events. Now, if only we could get a Canadian team to win the cup. Maybe next year. I won't mention my preference, or I could start trouble even online. I want to thank Jason for pushing Ottawa for a swifter, smarter, and better response in the COVID crisis. Alberta was also the first to roll out a comprehensive economic rebuilding package aimed at mitigating the impact of COVID, learning from the first wave, and preparing to have as fast of an economic recovery as possible. The Premier and the UCP government has cut taxes to spur the economy, and he's keeping the provincial budget from exploding in uncertain economic times. Look, leadership means tackling challenging public policy issues, not ignoring them, not kicking the can down the road and allowing them to get far worse. Let me say this as well. Throughout all of this, Premier Kenney has been fighting for Albertan interests and Canadian interests every single day. He and I understand the frustration that many Albertans have. I mention it a lot. As a Canadian Armed Forces veteran myself, I'll never forget at one of my town halls meeting a veteran who served almost 30 years in the military in Nisku, Alberta. He stood up and said he was proud to have served his country, but he wanted to leave it now because of what Mr. Trudeau had done to his province. This is personal. People are fighting to pay their bills. People are fighting for opportunity for their children. People are fighting to keep the True North strong, free, and united. I believe in this country with all my heart. That's why I joined the military. I'm a patriot, and I'm not afraid to say that. I also want you to know that Alberta is a very important part of Canada. You helped build this country. You fought for it, defended it, and you've helped out your fellow Canadians time after time. So I want you to know I've got your back. And when it comes to getting our country back on track, the federal Conservatives can learn a lot from our UCP cousins. And perhaps, if I can say so respectfully, I would also suggest that you can learn from the journey that your premier helped launch 4 years ago. The U in UCP stands for United. Conservatives only win when we're united. This is my main message to my caucus in Ottawa every single week. We lose when we're divided, and the country loses too. We saw that in Canada for many years when Liberals won time and time again for a decade and a half. We saw that in Alberta when the NDP won and set this province and our country back a decade. The NDP are not a party that supports working families anymore. The NDP and its activists across this country are the voices against the energy sector. That's the lifeblood of Alberta. They are the activists pushing for change in agricultural policy and food guides to hurt the beef and other ag sectors in Alberta and across the country. The NDP are more like a social justice movement that listens to voices on Twitter more than the voices of concern at the dinner tables in Edmonton, Calgary, or Okotoks. Don't forget that. If Conservatives allow our frustration to divide us, we only help political parties that will make things worse for our families and our businesses, whether it's the Trudeau Liberals in Ottawa or the NDP in Alberta. In unity, there is victory. And in unity, there is a strong future for our movement, for Alberta, and for Canada. I want to thank you for this great opportunity to speak with you today. I want to thank you for your passion and patriotism for Alberta and for Canada. And together, we're going to defend and stand up for a True North, strong, free, and united. Thank you very much.